Good morning. This is Karen with newclevelandradio.net, and it is time for your purpose, your power, your journey to authenticity. Now, what I'm going to tell all of you when you read the show notes and you find out about my guest, you may look at the show notes and say, well, this podcast, Karen, is not for me because my guest does talk to professionals, and yet we're all professionals. We're all living life professionally. And sometimes we just have to take a look at what we're doing to find out, is this really the best path that I'm on? I know I've done that many times, Carol, and I've, changed the path. And sometimes I felt like a fraud. It was like, well, why am I doing that? Because I'm not trying to be as successful as the CEO of a company. I'm just trying to be successful here at home with my family.
Yep.
So tell us, how did you even get into this business? Because there once was a time that this wasn't a business at all. And
That's
today
right.
we are helping each other. So give us a little bit of background.
Sure. Well, so what I discuss typically is the concept of rebalancing, how to juggle things all at the same time when life is coming at you very quickly. And when I think back on my own journey, a lot of my professional decisions were made by changes in my personal life. We're not just people at work, people at home. We're whole people who try to fit these different things into our lives. And so I had the great career going, but I really was yearning to be a mother. And so then when I had children, I remember sort of laughing at one point thinking, wow, I could manage multi-million dollar budgets and projects, and I cannot seem to get my child potty trained. Sometimes the biggest challenges are on the home front, and so I've had one of those careers and lives that's been a lot of zigzags. It's not been straight linear upward movement. And I've made a lot of decisions to do different things in my career based on, like I said, personal choices, wanting to be there with my kids. So I gave up the high powered job. Quite frankly, my husband worked a really demanding job and we couldn't both do that. And I wanted to be home with my kids. After a couple of years at home with my kids, I kind of kept one foot in the corporate waters and worked some gig work before gig work was really a thing. I would work part time, and so that evolved into more full time opportunities. But it was my own company. So my whole goal in raising my children was to make them think I worked as little as possible. So I would hustle at night, on the weekends, whenever they were napping. That's when I would get my work done a lot. And I would try to balance those things. And I remember somebody gave us the analogy of plate spinning, that you have all these plates in the air spinning, and your goal is just not to let any of them fall and break. And so I felt like that was my life. And I think I had an idea for a book probably about 20 years ago. And I let it sit on the back burner because I was too busy.
Yeah.
And especially as women, we spend so much time giving and doing and being all things to all people except maybe ourselves. And so I was too busy to think about writing a book and all of that. So I went through a series of different events, running my own company, ending up having a sudden divorce, which once again required me to make a different work decision because I needed to have stability and insurance benefits. I had at that point two kids who were teenagers and college was around the corner. And so I went back to the corporate world. So I'm one of those rare people who's been a consultant on my own, been a corporate executive, seen it from both sides. So I went back to the corporate world. I was doing that all over again with the grind and trying to be, single mom. Thankfully, I found love again in the midst of all this. And then at one point, it was pretty funny because I did not take my own advice. I did not heed my body's warnings. And my body started basically screaming at me through breast cancer, through high blood pressure, through all kinds of challenges. And I finally looked at my boss and I said, I think my body is telling me I just can't work like this anymore. So that was a real wake up call for me. And that's what led me to write my book, The Rebalancing Act. And so I kind of looked at what we women go through in our adult lives, juggling all the things, and what lessons I've learned, the traps I've fallen into. But I also interviewed 70 other women and men to get their ideas about these traps as well. And so that's where this work was born from. And that's what I'm on a mission to help other women do now is just try to make sure they're not losing themselves in the midst of all they're doing every day.
Well, it's funny because my blog this morning, I wrote it about um, how I've been a people pleaser most of my life, as many
Yep.
women are, because that's the upbringing that mothers tend to pass down to their
Mm-hmm.
children. Um, and I thought nothing of it most of my life until all of a sudden I woke up one day and I said, I'm the unhappiest person. And look at all these people around me who are smiling, they're getting what they want out of life. Like, how does
Yeah.
that happen? Um,
Yeah.
and that's when I had to start saying to myself, okay, what can I do for me? And it, it's not that easy.
No, it's not.
Uh,
And
there
it and
are,
it happens on purpose. You don't just accidentally fall into this wonderful balance and successful life.
and I'm glad you said that because, you know, um, this past week I've been juggling a lot of things. And yesterday morning, um, I canceled the podcast because I had to go to physical therapy in the morning. But I thought, oh, no big deal. I've gone many times. I'll come home. I can just jump in the seat. But what I did in physical therapy yesterday really caused me pain. And
Oh,
they told me that it might, but it never has in the past. So it was like, you, you're all wrong. But as soon as I sat down and went to start, I had to send a message saying, I'm sorry, I can't do this because I wasn't going to be good for my guests, but I wasn't going to be good for me either. And that's the first time I said to myself, I'm not good for me. I can't do it. So, what are some of the things? I mean, you interviewed all these people. I'm sure we all told you basically the same type of story. Um, but how did you get people to finally break our bad habits? Because they are bad habits.
yeah, yeah. And I did. I ended up with several themes that emerged, and we built the book around these archetypes of the way women tend to show up. And it doesn't matter what your work is, whether your work is in the home, whether your work is volunteering, being, raising your children, that's work. That
Yeah.
is work. And I had people who had amazing professional careers and gave that up to raise their children. So it doesn't matter what stage of life you're in. We all have these tendencies and these ways we tend to show up, and then these traps that can develop. And so depending on whether you and I'll borrow some stereotypes from my book, some of the archetypes, but it's perfect Paige, invisible Isabella, overloaded Olivia. That was the one more people than any other identified with. But whatever your stereotype is, the traps may look a little different, but I did find some universal things that people had done to get past them. And that's really the purpose of the book. It's not just to talk to you about the traps, it's to give you ideas and techniques of how to get past them. So these tips are gonna sound really simple and deceptively simple, but just because something's simple doesn't mean it's easy. And we know a lot more about how to behave than we demonstrate in our daily behaviors. So the first one is simply to think. And that sounds so silly to just say think. But what I'm talking about when I say think is take some dedicated time, remove all the distractions, whether you can only do that for 20 minutes or an hour or something. Find time on a weekend, in the evening, whenever it is, but stop and think about how you're spending your time. What are you spending most of your time on? But more than that, think about what your uppermost values are. What is most important to you in this life? And I like to ask a question that helps people in this thinking process, and that is, what is your legacy? What is it that you want to be known for? Because when you know what you want to be known for, what you want people to say about you after you're gone, from this stage of life or from this earth, then if you know your legacy, you know your uppermost values, then you can start looking at how you're spending your time and whether it's serving you to move you toward that or not. Because chances are, if you're like most of us and all the people that I interviewed, you've got some things that are just sucking your time and not helping you at all. And so when you can really stop and think about what those things are, and then think about what fills you up and what brings you joy and fulfillment and what helps you show up to be the best for the people around you who are most important, how can you spend time doing more of that? And it may be just little bitty things. You just need to pick one thing you can make an adjustment on. And that's what I mean by rebalancing, because life is never going to be in perfect balance. The minute it's balanced, something changes. So it's our agility and our ability in that moment to say, what is an adjustment I can make right now to help get me back toward that legacy, toward what's most important? So that's the thinking part. The second step is give up. And it's so funny. When I talk about giving up, I have to laugh because I hated to give up anything. I never wanted to be a failure. I never wanted to quit. And this type of giving up isn't going to feel like a failure. It's giving up what no longer serves you. And I think we have this tendency, just like you were talking about with your podcast yesterday, we feel like we need to show up out of duty or obligation. But if we can't be our best, then that's saying something.
Exactly.
And so when you can say no to something, that gives you the ability and the power to say a more powerful yes to what matters more. And when you think about it in those terms, that helps you make those priority decisions. It's like you don't have to do it all. You don't get it all by trying to do it all. So what can you give up? What can you give up that's either not serving you, or it's taking away your time and it's sucking the joy out of your life? We take on a lot of things out of obligation, and we just have to really examine those things. So that's the giving up part. And then let go is the third step. And that sounds like giving up. But when I talk about letting go, I'm talking about the things you choose to keep. So those uppermost priorities, the things you're going to continue doing, how can you let go within getting those things done? Because if you're a person who tends to want to have control over things, want to do things yourself, not want to delegate, possibly, could you let somebody else in? Could you try to get an idea from someone else? And yeah, maybe it's not the way you would have done it, but maybe it's even better. And sometimes we're just so locked into doing things our way that we don't see the opportunities in front of us to let go. And one really simple example, but when I was a single mom, teenagers at home, working full time back in the corporate world, it was hard for me to work a really challenging day and then get a good dinner on the table. My 14-year-old loved to cook. So guess what? She earned extra allowance by cooking dinner for us 2 or 3 nights a week so that we could be sure we had those meals on the table. It was weird to give that up, but we ended up eating a lot better because of that. So it's just little things like that. Or, maybe it's okay if you don't fold the kids' clothes. Maybe it's okay if something doesn't get done perfectly, because maybe good is good enough. So that's the letting go part. And those 3 steps have helped the dozens of people I interviewed. If I really boil it down to what helped them the most, regardless of how they showed up, it was those types of things. Because you can either think proactively, or life will throw some sort of curveball at you that will cause you to have to do it in the moment, urgently. And it's a whole lot easier, better, and less traumatic when you can do it proactively.
It's interesting because I lost my husband in January. And
Oh, I'm so sorry.
thank you. And it happened suddenly. In the back of my mind, we've talked about this for years and years. Um, and so I just went into mode.
Oh,
I
yeah.
kept
Yeah.
doing.
Yeah.
And my boys came into town and it was like, what can we do for you? And my comment was, well, just be here. But I was doing.
Yeah.
And my oldest son looked at me and he said, no, I'm not just going to be here. I'm going to help you. And my,
Wow.
my husband always was willing to help me, but I took everything on myself.
Yeah.
Even if, and he was an IT guy. If I was even having a problem with the computer, I would say, can you help me? And then I'd say, wait a second, I think I know how to fix it.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
So I was taking it all on,
Hmm.
getting angry because I was doing it all. But when my
Hmm.
son said, no, I'm going to help you, my first reaction was, no, you're not. I'm mom.
Yeah.
Now, he's in his 50s, so it's not like he's this little boy saying, hey, mommy, I want to help you.
Yeah.
And I finally looked at him and I said, okay, how are you going to do it? And we figured it out. And,
Good.
you know, it's wonderful because, yes, I'm still doing a lot of this on my own, but I've got direction. And
Hmm.
I know, as he keeps reminding me, if you can't do this, you let me know. You pick
Right.
up the phone and you call me. And I'll go, no, 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 I can do it. And yet I'm learning how to pick up the phone and going, my brain just isn't there today.
Yeah.
Can you do it for me? And because we've had that open discussion, and that's one of the things that most of us don't do when we take it all on.
Yeah.
So, how do you tell people, especially who are still in the corporate world, because that was my biggest problem? I was trying to prove myself every single day.
Oh,
So
yeah.
instead of working 8 hours, I was working 10 and 12 hours because I thought everybody would appreciate me.
Yeah.
Um, how do you help people break that mold because you aren't being appreciated, you're being used?
Yeah. It's funny you asked that question because I actually have an entire talk about that. I just spoke to a group of women engineers, and I think there's this tendency, especially really smart, capable, ambitious women, work really hard. And I think there's this idea that someday somebody's going to tap you on the shoulder and say, "You're doing a great job. I want to promote you." And that doesn't happen, or it rarely happens. And the fact of the matter is we're not typically noticed for how hard we're working. We're noticed for the way we show up. And so we have to be an advocate for ourselves, but that starts with knowing and accepting that you're enough just the way you are. I don't know what this whole I need to prove myself mentality. I think some of it probably comes from the glass ceilings and the
Right.
trailblazing that we've done over the last several decades as women to get to the place of being respected. But this constant striving, and actually one of the archetypes in my book is called she's striving Sabrina. The constant striving isn't what gets you ahead, and so much of how you get recognized in any role is the way you show up, and by that I mean the influence. So are you able to share the impact of the work that you're doing? So making sure somebody knows that what you just accomplished is important because here's what it did for the greater good. So making sure people know that, making sure that you advocate for yourself. And I don't know why we as women sometimes feel like it's bragging.
Right.
I mean, when you just can state, this is what I've accomplished and this is why it's important, and feel proud of that, that makes a big difference. And so that's how people notice. People are too busy. We're all too busy to notice and just sit there and say, I want to reward someone for doing a great job. And let's be honest, the people who get rewarded are typically the people who show up expecting and talking about and wanting to be
Right.
rewarded. And so we have to be those advocates for ourselves. But it starts with knowing that we're good enough. And the other thing that tends to really be hard is when we wear masks. You know, we don't want to show up being vulnerable. We don't want to show up as real people. But I'm constantly talking to leaders about the fact that these are real people with real lives, and if you want them to do their best work, you've got to understand who they are and what they come to work to do, and what's going on in the background, and care about them as a whole person. um, you know, we've got bad bosses out there who don't care, and they shouldn't be managing people, and that's another whole subject. but but by and large, I think people show up to do a good job, and we need to try to remove obstacles and let them do a good job. And so sometimes just trying to look like we have it all together is exhausting. I
Exactly.
was that person. I was always trying to look like I had it all together, even when I didn't. And then I finally let go of that. And that was so freeing when I finally could say, I think it was probably around the divorce, when I finally just had to say, I can't worry about what the gossip is. I can't worry about what people are saying. If they're my friends, they'll remain my friends. And if they're going to gossip, they never were my friends. And I've got children to take care of, and that's my priority. And so having that priority in my mind and just letting go of the noise really helped. But I think we can have this tendency to want to take everything on and look like we have it all together, and that's not real life.
Well, and my son was going through that right after his dad passed. Um, he was with me for a week, and then he went back to work, and he lives quite a distance from here. So that in itself was difficult, that he was
Yeah.
separating. But he went back to work and tried his best to do everything that he had to do. And in his mind, he was making one mistake after another. And instead of talking to his management about it, he just kept going in every day. But in his mind, he was failing. And at the end of the first week, he called me and basically said, you know, I think I have to quit my job. And I said, why? What happened? No, I'm making one mistake after another. They're going to end up firing me. And I said, has somebody said anything to you? Because this is how my brain works.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would
Yeah.
have been thinking the same way he did. Well, make a long story short, he finally went and talked to his manager, and his manager said, well, Alex, you have grief brain. Of course, yeah, you are going to make mistakes, but you're admitting to the mistakes. And now you're willing to go back and fix those mistakes.
Yes.
So, you're doing what you need to do, but you haven't asked any of us to help you.
Ah, isn't
And
that interesting?
and he looked at her, he goes, well, how can you? Because his thought when he heard that was, well, you can't bring my dad back. You can't take away my sadness. And she goes, look, I don't know what you're going through because I've never gone through anything like this. But I can imagine what you're going through because I don't even want to think of the day that I lose a parent. And that was frightening her in her own
Yeah.
position. And once this conversation came out, it was like now he could start to focus on him. As he focused on him, his job got better. Everything started getting better. Now, that's not to say that we're not going to fall back into those bad patterns because we will.
Yeah.
So, how do you help your client who, boy, they're doing really well, they're succeeding, and all of a sudden life happens and they feel like they're back to square one?
Well, first of all, I want to commend your son's boss, because that's a good boss. That was
Absolutely.
a really good leadership moment for the boss to understand and care. Um, so I'm glad, because I think when we are feeling overwhelmed, a lot of times just verbalizing that can help. And it sounds like it did help your son to feel like, okay, they get me. They know what's going on and they want to help. that's what you would hope for. And so I think when people feel like they're off track, that's where that thinking step really comes in. So, and I think there's this tendency to kind of spiral and think, okay, now this is bad, so that means this is going to be bad, and now the whole world's falling apart. And so I think just stepping out of the situation, having the self-regulation to be able to step away from the situation and say, what's really going on here? And then I love to ask these three questions. I always tell my kids who are now adults and out in the working world, I always tell them to ask three questions. What's the best that could happen? What's the worst that could happen? And then what's likely to happen? Because typically it's much less of a magnitude of a problem than the worst, but they tend to focus on the worst.
Oh.
Oh, I'm making mistakes, I'm going to get fired. And then it never is as bad once you can take time out and get some perspective. And getting perspective is hard when you're so busy. So the other thing that I like to say to people, especially these ambitious, driven people who are so successful on the outside and are feeling unsettled on the inside, I like to encourage them to really focus on that give up step and think about how they're spending their time. Because here's the problem. When you take on everything because you can, my mother used to always say, just because you can doesn't mean you should, but we take things on because we can. And we stay so filled with things to do that we have no time left for fulfillment. And we have no time left for those curveballs. Something happens out of the blue. For me, I've dealt with aging parents recently, and my father passed away last year after a long battle with Alzheimer's. But it ended up that my mom fell, and she was the healthy one. And then all of a sudden, she couldn't move her leg for 12 weeks. And boy, you talk about being incapacitated. That's a pretty debilitating injury. So things like that are going to happen. And that's also, I call it rebalancing in real time, but that's when you've got to be able to shift. And when you have so many things on your plate that you can't even think straight, it's a lot harder to have some of that margin in there when the curveballs come up. And then you'll have something major and you have no choice but to start canceling everything on your calendar. But what if you kept a little white space or margin in your day, in your week? What if you carved out some time just for you? It's so funny. We're all so scheduled with our digital calendars, and people never take time out between meetings just for think time.
Yeah.
And when I say, put an hour on your calendar, that's a meeting. It's a meeting for you and you. And it's a meeting just for you to think and do your project work. And they're like, oh, I'm just so overscheduled. It's like, schedule for yourself.
Absolutely.
Schedule the travel time, schedule the time for transitions between meetings. You've got to have some time that's just the white space. And we are busier than we've ever been. We have all this technology that we thought was going to make our life easier, and all it's done is convolute everything and make everything instant, So it's, I think, just taking that time out to think and figure out what's getting in the way of what's most important. That's going to go a long way toward moving past that situation.
It's interesting because up to about a year ago, I had this belief in my head, well, since I'm a podcaster and as a coach, I've got to keep recording. I have to keep having coaching clients. And my day was filled. And my day, because it was filled, I had evenings and weekends when I had to do any of my PR, because I'm a one-person business. And my husband asked me one day, he said, are you really happy with what you're doing? And I said, not anymore. But I love what I do, but I'm not happy with it. And he goes, what can you do differently? And coming from him, that was a huge question. But he saw that I was running myself ragged. And I contacted somebody who I really trusted about podcasting. And I said, what if I cut back? And he goes, great idea. And I looked at him and I said, no, 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 really. And he says, no, you don't need to produce 5 to 10 podcasts a week. You don't have to see 10 clients a week. He said,
Yep.
what are you doing? What is the part that you like? And I said, when I'm recording and when I'm talking to a client. It's the other stuff that I really don't like, but I've got so much of it now. He said, what if you had a fraction of that?
Yeah.
And I thought about it and it was like, oh, and I could be happier. And all of a sudden I saw that white space on my
Yeah.
calendar. And it meant like, if a friend called me and said, do you want to meet me at Starbucks? I could actually say yes rather than,
Yes.
oh, my calendar's full.
I love it.
Yeah.
I love it. And it's funny having had my own business for 18 years before I was corporate. I've worked with a lot of entrepreneurs, gig workers, fractional employees, and they have such a hard time figuring out when to get additional help, when you want to bring in somebody else to do some of that admin for you. The other thing people have trouble with is knowing when to raise rates. It's like when you're so busy that you can't even serve everybody and have margin for yourself, that means it's time to raise your prices. And we don't often stop to think about that. And as a consultant, I realized I could ask more and work less and end up making the same amount of money. That was a pretty good bargain. So,
Absolutely.
but those are tough juggling acts that we try to maintain. And we're just so busy. We're like the hamster running on the hamster wheel, and we never just jump off long enough to think, how is this serving me? I love that your husband asked you that question.
Oh, it was incredible. It was like you, of all people, asking me this question, but he was watching me. Okay.
Yeah.
He was working, contract work. So there were many days that he was here all day long doing nothing in theory, while I was up in the office working.
Yeah.
And I wasn't even coming out at lunchtime. And at dinner time, I would come out and I'd rush around and make dinner, and then clean up and then be back upstairs.
Yeah.
And I didn't realize how much time I was taking away from him, from us, but also the enjoyment of what I was doing.
That's right. When you can't enjoy it anymore, you have to ask how it's serving you. And
Absolutely.
I think we all need someone like your husband in our lives. We need a mentor. We need a sounding board, someone who can help us discern what's working and what's not.
Yes.
So that's a really important perspective. And when I was um, working as a mom and not working full time, having another group of moms, having my village that
Yep.
I could ask the questions about the kids, is this normal? What about this? What about that? Just having those things to sound off with each other and people you trust. Because now I think people get so many messages from social media. It's like, you don't even know if these people are real or AI
Yep.
bots, like much less whether this advice is accurate and true. So
And
we
it's
need real
interesting.
people in our lives to help us through those times.
Well, and it's interesting that you say that because I didn't have that village of a group of people. And with my husband gone, I started looking for that village. And it's interesting when you find people who have the commonalities, it's
Mhm.
so much easier to get up in the morning and know, you know what, I am doing this right. I may not
Yeah.
do it the same way that you're doing it, but I'm doing it right. It's right for me. So how
Yes.
can my listeners find you, get to know more about, your book and, some of the things that maybe will enhance their lives?
Yeah. Well, I'm glad you asked. I have a website. It's just my name, carolenneking.com. And you can get links to everything from the book to the women's group. I have a women's group that I lead called Rebalancing Revolution. And it's because when I started speaking about this, people would say, I want to continue the conversation. How
Right.
can we do that? So there are resources there. I mentioned getting clear on your legacy, the think step, your uppermost values, thinking about how you're spending your time. I have some resources to help people do that. And if they go on my website, they'll find those. And then I think they've got to fill out a connect form with their email, but then they get a weekly or bi-weekly tip from me about how to keep rebalancing front of mind. It's not salesy. It's just meant to kind of keep that awareness there.
Okay,
So lots of ways to connect with people, and I'd love to hear from your listeners.
very good. So all that information will be in our show notes. So anybody who's listening to this saying, hey, I just missed everything Carol said, go to the show notes. All the links will be there. And I want to thank you for joining us today. And
Thank
um,
you for
thank,
having me.
thank you. And don't get too hot down in Texas. Okay.
I'll try to stay cool. We have good
Uh,
air conditioners and pools. That's our
sounds,
that's our secret to success in the summer.
sounds wonderful. Have a great day. Bye bye now.
Thank you. You too.